The blood-red sunset painted the Wyoming prairie as Margaret Ziegler sat beside her empty wagon, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face. Everything she owned had been stolen, everything she'd traveled 2,000 miles to build her new life with. It was 1876, and the promise of opportunity in the West had turned to ash before she'd even reached Jackson. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her tense, one hand moving to the small derringer hidden in the folds of her skirt, the only possession the bandits hadn't taken. A tall figure on horseback materialized against the darkening sky. "Madam," the stranger called, tipping his hat as he slowed his chestnut stallion. "Looks like you've had some trouble." Margaret quickly wiped her tears, refusing to appear weak. "Nothing I can't handle," she replied, her Boston accent still clinging stubbornly to her words despite months on the trail. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the ground. He had the weathered look of someone who'd spent years under the harsh western sun, but his eyes remained kind beneath the brim of his hat. "Name's Gabriel Zimmerman," he said, keeping a respectful distance. "Most folks just call me Gabe." Margaret hesitated before answering. "Margaret Ziegler. I was bound for Jackson before bandits relieved me of everything I own." She gestured toward the empty wagon bed. "They even took the mule." Gabe surveyed the scene, his expression darkening. "Dakota gang, most likely. They've been hitting travelers hard these past months." He looked back at her empty wagon, then directly into her eyes. "You'll fill it again with what you love, Miss Ziegler. The West may be harsh, but it provides for those who don't give up." Margaret laughed bitterly. "And how exactly am I supposed to do that? I have no money, no supplies, and no way to reach town before nightfall." "Well," Gabe said, "you've got me now, and that's a start." Margaret studied him, the well-worn leather vest, the Colt revolver at his hip, the quiet confidence in his stance. In Boston, she would never have trusted a stranger who appeared on a lonely road at sunset. But this wasn't Boston, and she had little choice. "Why would you help me?" she asked directly. "Because out here, we help each other survive," Gabe answered simply. "Otherwise, none of us would make it." As darkness crept across the prairie, Gabe helped Margaret secure her wagon. He offered her some jerky and water from his saddlebag, which she accepted gratefully. Her stomach had been empty since morning. "Jackson's about 15 miles north," he explained, building a small fire. "We'll head there at first light. I know some good folks who might help you get back on your feet." Margaret pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I came west to start a millinery shop," she said quietly. "I brought fabrics, ribbons, feathers. Everything I'd need. My aunt taught me the trade before she passed." "A hat shop?" Gabe looked up from the fire. "Jackson could use one of those. Ladies there order hats from catalogs or make do with what the general store carries." "Well, it doesn't matter now," Margaret said, staring into the flames. "Everything's gone." "Not everything," Gabe countered. "You still have your skill. Nobody can take that from you." As the fire crackled between them, Margaret found herself studying her unexpected companion. His hands were calloused, but gentle as he prepared coffee in a battered tin pot. The firelight cast shadows across his face, highlighting a scar that ran along his jawline. "What's your story, Mr. Zimmerman?" she asked. "Not much to tell," he replied, pouring the steaming coffee into a cup and passing it to her. "Came west after the war. Tried my hand at mining, cattle driving, and a bit of everything else. These days I raise horses on a small spread outside Jackson. Just returned from delivering a pair to the Army outpost at Fort Laramie." "And your family?" A shadow passed over his face. "Lost them to typhoid in '68. My wife Sarah and our boy." "I'm sorry," Margaret said softly. Gabe nodded his acknowledgement. "What about you? Family waiting back east?" Margaret shook her head. "My parents died when I was young. My aunt raised me, taught me her trade. When she passed last year, there was nothing keeping me in Boston." She stared into the darkness beyond their small circle of light. "I wanted to build something that was truly mine." "And you will," Gabe said with quiet certainty. That night, Margaret slept in her wagon while Gabe kept watch by the fire. Despite her circumstances, she felt strangely at peace. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps it was knowing she wasn't alone. Morning broke with golden light streaming across the prairie. Margaret awoke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Gabe had already rekindled the fire and was preparing a simple breakfast. "Good morning," he greeted her. "Thought you could use a proper meal before we ride." Margaret climbed down from the wagon, smoothing her rumpled dress as best she could. "You're very kind, Mr. Zimmerman." "Just Gabe," he corrected, handing her a plate. As they ate, he outlined his plan. "We'll hitch my horse to your wagon. It won't be the most comfortable ride, but it'll get us to Jackson by midday." "And then what?" Margaret asked. "First, we'll speak to Sheriff Miller about the robbery. Then we'll get you situated at the boarding house. Mrs. Fletcher runs a decent place. After that, we'll figure out the rest." The simplicity of his plan was comforting. For the first time since the robbery, Margaret felt a flicker of hope. True to Gabe's word, they arrived in Jackson by early afternoon. The town was larger than Margaret had expected, a proper main street lined with wooden buildings, a church steeple visible at one end, and the constant movement of people, wagons, and horses. Sheriff Miller's office was a small building with a jail attached to the back. The sheriff himself was a barrel-chested man with a thick mustache and skeptical eyes. "Dakota gang, you say?" he asked after hearing their story. "How many were there?" "3," Margaret answered. 2 carried rifles, and the leader had a revolver with a pearl handle. The sheriff nodded. "Sounds like Lyle Dakota and his brothers. Been causing trouble all through the territory." He scratched some notes in a ledger. "I'll send wires to the other towns, but don't get your hopes up about recovering your belongings, Miss Ziegler. Those boys move fast." Margaret's shoulders sagged, though she'd expected as much. "What about compensation?" Gabe asked. "The territorial government has that fund for victims of banditry." Sheriff Miller stroked his mustache. "She could apply. Might get something in 3 to 6 months." 6 months, Margaret exclaimed. "What am I supposed to do until then?" "That's not for me to say, madam," the sheriff replied. "But Zimmerman here seems to have taken an interest in your situation. Maybe he's got some ideas." Outside the sheriff's office, Margaret fought back tears of frustration. "This is hopeless." "No, it's not," Gabe said firmly. "Let's get you settled at the boarding house, and then we'll talk options." Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house stood 2 stories tall, with a wide porch and clean white curtains in every window. The proprietress herself was a widow in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. "Room and board is $2 a week, payable in advance," she informed Margaret after Gabe had explained the situation. Margaret's face fell. "I'll cover the first month," Gabe interrupted, already reaching for his wallet. "Mr. Zimmerman, I couldn't possibly consider it a loan," he said quietly. "You can repay me when you're on your feet." Mrs. Fletcher watched this exchange with interest. "New arrivals often need a helping hand," she commented, accepting Gabe's payment. "I came west as a bride with nothing but a trunk of linens and my mother's silver teapot. 26 years later, I own this place outright." She showed Margaret to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor. "Dinner's at 6 sharp. Don't be late or you'll miss out." Left alone, Margaret sat on the narrow bed and allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. Everything had gone wrong, yet somehow she'd found kindness in this strange place. The thought of being indebted to Gabe Zimmerman troubled her, not because she doubted his intentions, but because independence had been her goal in coming west. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Gabe standing there, hat in hand. "I've been thinking," he said. "The mercantile might have some basic materials you could use to start making hats. Nothing fancy, but enough to show the ladies of Jackson what you can do. Margaret shook her head. I appreciate the thought, but I can't ask you to invest more in me. What if I told you I know at least 3 women in town who would pay good money for a quality hat right now? Gabe persisted. The banker's wife, the doctor's sister, and the hotel owner's daughter are all preparing for the Founders' Day celebration next month. They order their finery from catalogs, but deliveries are unreliable out here. Margaret felt a spark of interest despite herself. The Founders' Day celebration? Big social event. Dancing, speeches, a proper dinner. Everyone who's anyone attends, wearing their finest. Gabe shifted his weight. If you could provide hats for those ladies before then, word would spread. You'd have orders coming in before you know it. The idea was tempting. Even with basic materials, I'd need a workspace, and there's a small room off the back of my friend Tom's saddle shop, Gabe said. He uses it for storage, but I bet he'd rent it to you cheap. It has good light from 2 windows. Margaret studied him. You've given this quite a lot of thought, Mr. Zimmerman. A slight flush colored his tanned cheeks. I believe in making things happen rather than waiting for luck to change. That afternoon, Gabe introduced Margaret to Tom Wilson, owner of the saddle shop. The storage room was dusty but spacious enough, with a workbench already in place. I can spare it for $2 a month, Tom said. Been meaning to clear it out anyway. Next, they visited Jackson Mercantile, where Margaret carefully selected the most versatile materials. Their limited budget would allow plain straw forms that could be shaped, several yards of ribbon, some basic feathers, and a bolt of serviceable fabric that could be dyed different colors. It's not what I'm used to working with, she admitted as they left the store, but I can make it work. That's the spirit, Gabe said, carrying her purchases. Now, let me introduce you to Mrs. Hargrove, the banker's wife. She's been complaining about needing a new hat for weeks. Mrs. Evelyn Hargrove was a formidable woman with expensive taste and clear opinions. She received Margaret in her well-appointed parlor, examining her with the same critical eye she might use on a horse at auction. So you're a milliner from Boston? She asked, offering tea. What brings you to our little town? Margaret provided a simplified version of her story, emphasizing her training and experience while downplaying her recent misfortune. I'd be honored to create something special for the Founders' Day celebration, she concluded. Mrs. Hargrove considered this. My usual milliner is in Denver. I order twice yearly. She fingered the lace on her cuff. But the last shipment was disappointing. The feathers were crushed beyond salvation. I understand the challenges of transportation, Margaret said, sensing an opportunity. Working locally would eliminate that risk. Do you have any samples of your work? Margaret's heart sank. Unfortunately, no. My portfolio was lost during my journey. Mrs. Hargrove frowned. But Gabe interjected smoothly. Miss Ziegler could create a preliminary design for your approval before proceeding. I suppose that would be acceptable, Mrs. Hargrove conceded. I require something in blue to match my new gown. Something elegant, but not ostentatious. I'll sketch some ideas tomorrow, Margaret promised, relieved. As they left the Hargrove residence, Margaret turned to Gabe. Thank you. You saved that meeting. You did the hard part, he replied. She was impressed by you, even if she didn't show it. Similar meetings with the doctor's sister and the hotel owner's daughter yielded tentative commissions, contingent on approved designs. By the time evening fell, Margaret had the promise of 3 potential orders, enough to repay Gabe for the materials and perhaps have a little left over to reinvest. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret threw herself into her work. The storage room at Tom's saddle shop was transformed into a modest millinery workshop. She worked from dawn until dusk, crafting hats that would showcase her skills despite the limited materials. Gabe visited often, sometimes bringing meals when she forgot to eat, other times just checking on her progress. He never stayed long, seeming to sense when she needed space to create, yet his brief visits became highlights in her focused days. "The blue one is coming along nicely," he commented one afternoon, admiring Mrs. Hargrove's hat taking shape on the workbench. "It's still missing something," Margaret frowned, studying her creation. "The shape is right, but it needs something like this." Gabe reached into his pocket and produced a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Margaret unwrapped it to find a collection of exquisite peacock feathers. "Where did you get these?" she gasped, lifting one to examine its perfect iridescent eye. "Trading post about 20 miles west," he said casually. "The owner's son returned from a trip to California with some exotic goods." "They're perfect," Margaret breathed. "But they must have been expensive." Gabe shrugged. "Consider it an investment in your future success." Margaret carefully placed the feather against the hat, immediately seeing how it transformed the piece. "Thank you," she said, meeting his eyes. "For everything." "Just doing what neighbors do," he replied, though something in his gaze suggested it might be more than that. The day of the first fittings arrived. Mrs. Hargrove swept into the workshop with the imperious air of royalty, clearly expecting to be disappointed. But when Margaret unveiled the blue creation now enhanced with strategically placed peacock accents, the woman's expression changed. "Oh my," she breathed, reaching for it with uncharacteristic eagerness. "It's exactly what I envisioned." Margaret helped her try it on, making minor adjustments to the fit. Mrs. Hargrove admired herself in the small mirror Margaret had installed. "You have remarkable talent, Miss Ziegler," she declared. "This surpasses anything I've received from Denver." Word spread quickly after that. The doctor's sister and the hotel owner's daughter were equally pleased with their hats. Before the Founders' Day celebration even occurred, Margaret had received orders from 5 more of Jackson's prominent women. "You need a proper shop," Gabe told her one evening as he helped her lock up. "Something on Main Street where ladies can visit you." "That's still a distant dream," Margaret replied, though she'd begun to think about it too. "I need more capital." "Well, about that," Gabe said, pulling an envelope from his vest pocket. Sheriff Miller received word. They caught one of the Dakota brothers near Cheyenne. He had some of the stolen goods, and there was a distribution of recovered property. "This came for you." Margaret opened the envelope to find a bank draft for $30 compensation for her losses. "It's not much compared to what I lost," she said, "but it's something. Combined with what you've earned from these orders, it might be enough for a small space," Gabe suggested. The Founders' Day celebration provided the perfect showcase for Margaret's work. As Mrs. Hargrove, the doctor's sister, and the hotel owner's daughter paraded through town in their custom hats, heads turned and whispers spread. During the celebration dinner, held in the town's newly constructed assembly hall, Margaret found herself approached by women she'd never met, all inquiring about her services. By evening's end, she had a list of potential clients that would keep her busy for months. "You've made quite an impression," Gabe commented as they stepped outside for air. The night was cool, stars scattered like diamonds across the Wyoming sky. "Thanks to you," Margaret said. "I would never have managed without your help." Gabe shook his head. "I just provided a few introductions. Your talent did the rest." Music drifted from the hall behind them. A waltz played on piano and fiddle. Couples had begun to dance. "Would you care to?" Gabe asked, offering his hand. Margaret hesitated. Since arriving in Jackson, she'd been so focused on survival and rebuilding that she'd scarcely allowed herself to think of anything else. But tonight, with the music playing and Gabe looking at her with those kind eyes, she felt something shift. "I'd be delighted," she said, placing her hand in his. Gabe led her onto the dance floor, his hand respectfully at her waist as they moved among the other couples. He was a surprisingly graceful dancer for a man who spent most of his days on horseback. "Where did you learn a dance like this?" she asked. "Sarah insisted I learn before our wedding," he replied. "Said she wouldn't have a husband who couldn't waltz properly." "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. His expression softened with memory, but there was no pain in it now, just fond recollection. As they danced, Margaret became aware of approving glances from the townspeople. In just a few weeks, she had gone from destitute stranger to respected businesswoman with prospects. And Gabe, it seemed, was well regarded in the community. "People are watching us," she murmured. "That's because you're the most beautiful woman in the room," he replied simply. Margaret felt herself blush. "Hardly that." "I disagree," Gabe said, his eyes never leaving hers. "From the moment I saw you sitting beside that empty wagon, I thought you were extraordinary. Most people would have given up." "I nearly did," she admitted. "But you didn't. That's what matters." The music ended, and they joined the applause. Before they could resume their conversation, Margaret was swept away by Mrs. Hargrove, who insisted on introducing her to several prominent women from neighboring settlements. Later that evening, Gabe walked Margaret back to the boarding house. The streets of Jackson were quiet now, most residents still at the celebration or already home in bed. "I've been thinking," Gabe said as they reached Mrs. Fletcher's porch. "There's a small storefront available next to the dressmaker's shop. The rent is reasonable and the location would be perfect for your business." "I've seen it," Margaret admitted. "But even with the compensation money, I'm not sure I can afford it yet." "What if we shared the risk?" Gabe suggested. "I could provide the remaining capital you need as an investment, not a loan. In return, I'd receive a small percentage of the profits until my investment is repaid, plus a modest return." Margaret stopped walking. "You're proposing a business partnership?" "I am," he confirmed. "It makes good sense. You have the skill and reputation already building. The location would help you grow faster. And I have some savings that could be working harder than they are sitting in the bank." "Why would you do this?" Margaret asked, studying his face in the moonlight. Gabe was silent for a moment. "Because I believe in you," he finally said. "And because I've come to care about what happens to you." Margaret's heart quickened. "Mr. Zimmerman, Gabe," he corrected softly. "Gabe," she amended. "I care about what happens to you too." He took her hand gently. "Then think about my offer. Both parts of it." "Both parts." "The business partnership," he clarified, "and whatever else might develop between us, if you're willing." Margaret felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the mild spring evening. "I'll think about it," she promised. He kissed her hand before bidding her good night, the gesture both old-fashioned and deeply sincere. Inside her room, Margaret found herself too full of emotions to sleep. In Boston, she had resigned herself to spinsterhood, focused on her craft rather than pursuing marriage. Yet here in the wilderness of Wyoming, she had found not only a new beginning for her business, but potentially for her heart as well. The next morning, Margaret visited the vacant storefront. Its large windows would provide excellent natural light for her work, and the location on Main Street guaranteed visibility. She could already envision how she would arrange the space: a display area at the front, a consultation area with comfortable chairs, and a workroom in the back. "It needs some attention," observed Mr. Peterson, the property owner, "but structurally it's sound." "What would the terms be?" Margaret asked. $10 a month, first and last month's rent required up front. Tenant responsible for any improvements. Margaret calculated quickly. The compensation money plus her earnings from the recent commissions would cover the initial rent, but improvements and additional inventory would require more capital. Gabe's offer of partnership made practical sense. "I'd like to discuss it with my potential business partner," she told Mr. Peterson. "Could you give me until tomorrow?" That afternoon, Margaret rode out to Gabe's horse ranch, borrowing Mrs. Fletcher's gentle mare for the journey. She had never visited his property before, and she was curious to see where and how he lived. The ranch was modest, but well-maintained: a small cabin with a covered porch, a sturdy barn, and several corrals where horses grazed. As she approached, Gabe emerged from the barn, surprise and pleasure crossing his face when he recognized her. "Margaret," he called, wiping his hands on a cloth as he walked to meet her. This is unexpected. I hope I'm not intruding, she said, allowing him to help her dismount. Never, he assured her. Would you like some coffee? Or I could make tea. The inside of Gabe's cabin was simply furnished but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, bookshelves another. Margaret was surprised by the number of books, volumes of history, poetry, and practical guides to ranching and horse breeding. You're quite the reader, she remarked. Winter nights are long, he replied. And I've always believed in improving one's mind. As he prepared coffee, Margaret explained her visit. I've seen the storefront, and I'd like to accept your offer of partnership. The terms Mr. Peterson outlined are fair, but as you suggested, I'll need additional capital for improvements and inventory. Gabe nodded, setting a mug before her. I'm prepared to invest $200. That should cover what you need to start properly. It's more than generous, Margaret said. I've drafted an agreement. She removed a folded paper from her reticule. You'd receive 15% of profits until your investment is repaid with interest, after which you'd retain a 5% share as founding partner. Gabe studied the document. This is very professional. My father was an attorney, Margaret explained. He taught me the importance of clear agreements, even especially among friends. Smart man, Gabe commented, signing the paper without further discussion. Now, would you like to see the horses? I have a new foal I'm particularly proud of. The afternoon passed pleasantly as Gabe showed Margaret around his property. His knowledge of horses was extensive, his passion for breeding and training them evident in everything he said. The animals clearly trusted him, approaching the fence when he called. They're magnificent, Margaret said, stroking the velvet nose of a chestnut mare. I know nothing about horses beyond riding Mrs. Fletcher's placid old Bess. I could teach you, Gabe offered. Every lady in Wyoming should know horseflesh. I'd like that, she replied, though I doubt I'll ever be as knowledgeable as you. As sunset approached, Gabe insisted on escorting Margaret back to town. They rode side by side, the conversation flowing easily between them. Margaret found herself sharing stories of her childhood in Boston, her apprenticeship with her aunt, dreams she'd never voiced to anyone. I always wanted to create something beautiful, she confessed. Something that would bring joy and confidence to the wearer. My aunt understood that. She said a well-made hat wasn't just decoration, it was armor for facing the world. Wise woman, Gabe commented. Is that why you came west? To spread that wisdom. Margaret laughed. Hardly that noble. I came because Boston was full of established milliners, many with better connections than I had. Here, I thought I could distinguish myself. Despite the bandits, it seems you were right. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Margaret signed the lease on the storefront and threw herself into transforming it into Ziegler millinery. Gabe helped with the heavier work, building display shelves, repairing the counter, installing a larger work table in the back room. Other townspeople contributed as well. Tom Wilson crafted a beautiful wooden sign for the facade, and Mrs. Fletcher donated curtains for the windows. The grand opening was scheduled for the first Saturday in June. Margaret had prepared a selection of ready-made hats to display, while keeping time available for custom orders. Mrs. Hargrove had promised to bring several friends from neighboring ranches, and notices had been posted in the local newspaper. The evening before the opening, Margaret stood in the center of her shop, taking in the transformation. What had been an empty, dusty space was now an elegant establishment that wouldn't have looked out of place in Boston. Tears pricked her eyes. Having second thoughts? Gabe asked from the doorway, where he'd been watching her. Margaret shook her head. Happy tears, she assured him. I can't believe how far I've come since that day by the empty wagon. Gabe crossed the room to stand beside her. I can. You're the most determined woman I've ever met. Only because I had help, Margaret said, turning to face him. You believed in me before anyone else did before I believed in myself again. That's not true, Gabe countered. You never stopped believing. You might have been discouraged, but never defeated. Margaret's heart swelled with emotion. Over these weeks of working together, sharing meals and building both a business and a friendship, her feelings for Gabe had deepened into something she could no longer deny. "I have something for you," Gabe said, producing a small package from his pocket. "A good luck gift for tomorrow." Margaret unwrapped it to find a beautiful silver hatpin topped with a small horseshoe. "It's perfect," she breathed. "I had it made by the silversmith in Casper," Gabe explained. "The horseshoe for luck and—" He hesitated. "And—" Margaret prompted. "I thought it could be a reminder of me," he admitted. "Of us." "Us." Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. Gabe took her hands in his. "Margaret, I know it hasn't been long, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, your strength, your determination, your kindness. I thought after Sarah that part of my life was over, but you've awakened something I thought was gone forever." Margaret's eyes filled with tears again. "Gabe, you don't have to answer now," he said quickly. "I know you're focused on the shop, and that should be your priority. I just wanted you to know how I feel." But Margaret didn't need time to consider. The answer was already in her heart. "I love you too," she said simply. The joy that spread across Gabe's face was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. Slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was gentle and brief, but it sealed a promise between them. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said when they parted, "remember that you've already succeeded beyond measure. And I'll be right there beside you." The opening day of Ziegler Millinery exceeded all expectations. Women from Jackson and surrounding areas filled the small shop from opening until closing, admiring the displays and placing orders. By day's end, Margaret had sold every ready-made hat and booked commissions that would keep her busy for weeks. "Congratulations," Gabe said when the last customer had departed. He had stayed throughout the day, helping wherever needed, serving tea to waiting customers, running to the mercantile for additional receipt paper, even holding babies while mothers tried on hats. Margaret sank into a chair, exhausted but elated. "I can't believe it," she said. "Mrs. Hargrove has invited me to tea next week to meet the Ladies' Auxiliary Committee. The mayor's wife commissioned 3 hats for her trip to Denver. Even that dreadful Mrs. Phillips, who imports everything from New York, bought 2 hats. You've conquered Jackson," Gabe laughed, kneeling beside her chair. "Next, the territory. Then the nation." Margaret touched his cheek affectionately. "I have more modest ambitions. A successful shop. A good life." She hesitated, then added, "Someone to share it with." Gabe caught her hand and pressed it to his lips. "Margaret Ziegler, would you consider sharing that life with me? As my wife?" The question was unexpected, but not unwelcome. Margaret had known they were moving in this direction, but she hadn't anticipated a proposal so soon. "Are you certain?" she asked. "My business will demand much of my time, and I wouldn't have it any other way," Gabe interrupted. "Your passion for your work is part of what I love about you. We would be partners in every sense, supporting each other's dreams, building something together." Margaret considered his words. In Boston, marriage would have likely meant the end of her professional ambitions. But here, with this man, she sensed a different possibility, a true partnership of equals. "Yes," she said finally. "Yes, I will marry you, Gabriel Zimmerman." Their wedding took place in late August, when the Wyoming summer was beginning to soften toward autumn. It was a simple ceremony in Jackson's small church, attended by the friends they'd made in town. Mrs. Fletcher dabbed at her eyes throughout the service, while Mrs. Hargrove nodded approvingly from the front pew. Margaret wore a dress of ivory silk that she'd ordered from Denver, and atop her dark hair sat her masterpiece, a wedding hat she'd created in secret hours, adorned with silk flowers and seed pearls. Gabe, in a new suit, looked at her with such love that she nearly forgot her vows from the sheer emotion of the moment. After a brief honeymoon at a hot springs resort in the mountains, they settled into a rhythm of shared life. Margaret continued to build her millinery business, which flourished beyond her initial projections. Gabe expanded his horse breeding operation, focusing on quality stock that commanded premium prices from the army and wealthy ranchers. They divided their time between the ranch and a small house they purchased in Jackson, allowing Margaret to maintain her shop while giving them privacy away from Mrs. Fletcher's watchful eye. The arrangement wasn't conventional, but it suited them perfectly. By their first anniversary, Margaret had hired an assistant, a young woman named Emma, with nimble fingers and a good eye for design. This allowed her more flexibility to spend time at the ranch, where she had indeed learned to ride properly and even to help with the horses. "You've taken to ranch life better than I expected," Gabe commented one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. "And you've become quite the businessman," Margaret replied. "That ledger system you implemented for the shop has increased our profits by nearly 20%. Gabe chuckled. "We make a good team, Mrs. Zimmerman." "The best," she agreed, leaning against his shoulder. Life wasn't without challenges. The harsh winter of 1877 brought heavy snows that isolated the ranch for weeks. A fire damaged part of the shop in the spring of 1878, requiring extensive repairs. And there were personal disappointments, too. Their hopes for a child remained unfulfilled as months turned into years. "Perhaps it's not meant to be," Margaret said one night, after yet another monthly disappointment. "Perhaps our businesses are our legacy." Gabe held her close. "If that's how it turns out, I'll still count myself the luckiest man in Wyoming. But let's not lose hope yet." Their patience was rewarded in the summer of 1879, when Margaret discovered she was expecting. The news brought both joy and anxiety, as she was 32 and considered somewhat old for a first pregnancy. "Dr. Lawrence says I'm in excellent health," she assured Gabe when he expressed concern. "And Mrs. Fletcher has promised to help with the shop when the time comes." The pregnancy progressed without complication, though Margaret was forced to reduce her hours at the shop as her condition advanced. Emma proved herself capable of managing day-to-day operations, freeing Margaret to prepare for the baby's arrival. Their son, Thomas Gabriel Zimmerman, was born on a snowy night in February 1880. He had his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined expression, evident even in his first hours of life. "He's perfect," Gabe whispered, cradling the tiny bundle with tears in his eyes. "Absolutely perfect." Margaret watched her husband with their child, her heart so full it might burst. "He is," she agreed. "And so is this life we've built." As Thomas grew, he showed an affinity for both his parents' vocations. He loved riding with his father from the moment he could sit a horse, but he also displayed artistic talent and an eye for design that delighted his mother. By the time he was 5, Jackson had grown into a substantial town. The railroad had arrived, bringing increased commerce and opportunity. Ziegler Millinery had expanded to include ladies' accessories of all kinds, and Gabe's horse breeding operation had earned a reputation throughout the territory. In the spring of 1886, almost exactly 10 years after Gabe had found Margaret beside her empty wagon, they celebrated the opening of a new, larger shop on Jackson's main street. The Ziegler Zimmerman Emporium combined millinery, quality imported goods, and a select offering of Gabe's leatherwork custom saddles and accessories that had become a profitable sideline to his horse business. "Did you ever imagine this?" Margaret asked as they surveyed the crowded shop during the grand opening. Thomas, now 6, was proudly showing customers around, his manners impeccable despite his excitement. "Not the details," Gabe admitted. "But I knew that day that you were something special, that you'd fill that empty wagon again, many times over." Margaret squeezed his hand. "We filled it together." Later that evening, after Thomas was asleep and they had retired to the parlor of their townhouse, Gabe presented Margaret with a small wooden box. "What's this?" she asked, opening it to find a miniature replica of a covered wagon, exquisitely carved from walnut. "I commissioned it from that woodworker in Casper," Gabe explained, "to commemorate our beginning." Margaret turned the delicate object in her hands, noting the tiny details, even the wheels turned. "It's beautiful," she said, "but it's not empty." "Look inside," Gabe suggested. Margaret peered into the miniature wagon bed to find a velvet pouch. Opening it, she gasped at the sight of a gold locket set with small diamonds. "Open it," Gabe urged. Inside were two tiny portraits, one of Gabe, one of Thomas, and engraved on the inner lid were the words, "You filled it with what you love." Tears sprang to Margaret's eyes as Gabe fastened the locket around her neck. "And I do love you," she whispered. "Both of you, more than I ever thought possible." "And we love you," Gabe replied, gathering her into his arms. "The woman who never gave up, who built something from nothing, who made a family from strangers." Outside their window, Jackson continued to grow and change, a testament to the pioneer spirit that had brought them all west. But within the walls of their home, Margaret and Gabe had created something timeless, a love born of adversity, strengthened through partnership, and sustained by mutual respect and admiration. The empty wagon of Margaret's darkest day had indeed been filled again, not just with material success, but with the richness of a life fully lived and deeply loved. In the years that followed, the Zimmerman family continued to thrive. Their business interests expanded with the growing town, and in 1888, Margaret gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Elizabeth, after Gabe's first wife and Margaret's beloved aunt. Thomas proved to be a devoted big brother, protective and kind from the moment he first held his sister's tiny hand. The turn of the decade brought changes to Wyoming territory. In 1890, it achieved statehood, becoming the 44th state in the Union and the first to grant women full voting rights. Margaret, who had become increasingly involved in the suffrage movement, celebrated this milestone with particular joy. "To think," she told Gabe as they toasted the news, "that our daughter will grow up never knowing a time when women couldn't vote." "She has you to thank for that," Gabe replied. "You and women like you, who wouldn't take no for an answer." Margaret had indeed become a respected voice in local politics, using her position as a successful businesswoman to advocate for women's rights and educational opportunities. The millinery shop that had started her Western adventure had evolved into a small empire of retail establishments throughout Wyoming, managed now by Emma as a full partner, while Margaret focused on broader initiatives. Gabe's horse breeding business had similarly prospered. His keen eye for quality stock and fair business practices had earned him contracts with the U.S. Army and wealthy ranchers across the West. Though he remained hands-on with the training, he had hired capable ranch hands to manage the day-to-day operations. Thomas, now 16, showed every sign of following in both his parents' entrepreneurial footsteps. He had already started a small business supplying hand-carved wooden toys to their stores and others in the region, saving his earnings for college with plans to study business and engineering. 8-year-old Sarah, bright and inquisitive, spent hours in her mother's design studio learning to sketch and create, while also delighting in afternoon rides with her father. She was, everyone agreed, the perfect blend of both parents Margaret's artistic eye and Gabe's practical nature. On a warm evening in the summer of 1896, the family gathered on the porch of their ranch house. 20 years had passed since Gabe had found Margaret beside her empty wagon, and they had made it a tradition to mark the anniversary each year. "Tell us the story again, Mama," Sarah requested, curled against her mother's side on the porch swing. Again, Margaret laughed. "You've heard it 100 times. But it's the best story," Thomas insisted from his position on the porch railing. Though nearly a man, he still loved family traditions. Gabe, rocking gently in his chair, smiled encouragement. "Go ahead, love. I never tire of hearing it either." So Margaret told the story once more of her journey west, the bandits who took everything, and the kind cowboy who appeared at sunset with words of hope that proved prophetic. "You'll fill it again with what you love," she quoted, smiling at Gabe. He was right, though neither of us knew then exactly what that would mean. "I had hopes," Gabe admitted with a wink. The children groaned good-naturedly at this display of parental affection, though Thomas's expression held understanding beyond his years. He had recently begun courting Emma's niece, Rebecca, and Margaret suspected he was experiencing first love's sweet uncertainty. As twilight deepened into night, Gabe produced a bottle of fine champagne, a luxury still rare in Wyoming. A toast, he proposed, filling glasses for himself and Margaret and smaller amounts of the bubbling liquid for the children to participate. "To 20 years," he said, raising his glass. "To empty wagons filled with dreams come true. To the woman who never gave up. And to the man who believed," Margaret added, her eyes shining with love. "To family, to partnership, to building something that will outlast us." To Mama and Papa, Thomas and Sarah chorused, clinking their glasses carefully. Later, after the children had gone to bed, Margaret and Gabe stood together under the vast Wyoming sky, brilliant with stars. The ranch sprawled around them, peaceful in the moonlight, a far cry from the desolate spot where they had first met. "Do you ever regret it?" Gabe asked suddenly. "Coming west? All the hardships?" Margaret considered the question seriously, as was her way. "Not for a moment," she finally said. "Every difficulty led me here, to this life, to you and our children. How could I regret that?" Gabe pulled her close, his arms as strong and sure as they had been 20 years earlier. "When I found you that day, I was returning from delivering horses to Fort Laramie. I nearly took another route home, a shortcut through the hills." "But you didn't," Margaret said softly. "No. Something told me to take the main trail. Call it instinct, call it fate." He kissed the top of her head. "Best decision I ever made." "Besides marrying me," she teased. "That wasn't a decision, it was an inevitability," he replied. "From the moment I saw you, I knew you were my future." As they stood together under the star-filled sky, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The empty wagon that had symbolized her lowest point had become merely the beginning of a story, their story, still unfolding with each passing year. Wyoming had changed, Jackson had grown, and they had changed too. Gray now threaded Gabe's hair, and fine lines marked the corners of Margaret's eyes. But the essence of what had drawn them together remained unaltered, his steady strength, her creative determination, and the love that had transformed two separate paths into one shared journey. "What do you think the next 20 years will bring?" Margaret wondered aloud. "More challenges, more joys," Gabe answered thoughtfully. "Thomas will finish college, perhaps marry. Sarah will continue to surprise us with her talents. You'll probably become Wyoming's first female governor." Margaret laughed. "Hardly that. But I do have plans for expanding the Women's College Initiative in Cheyenne." "Of course you do," Gabe said fondly. "And I wouldn't have it any other way." They fell silent, content in each other's company and the knowledge of a life well lived. The empty wagon of their beginning had indeed been filled with family, with purpose, with love that had only deepened with time. And as the night breeze carried the scent of sage across the Wyoming prairie, Margaret sent a silent thanks to the younger self who had refused to surrender to despair, and to the man who had appeared when she needed him most, bearing not just practical help, but words that had proven true beyond her wildest dreams. She had filled her life again with what she loved, and that had made all the difference.